So that being said, Connor alluded to it, much has been made this week of fire Marvin Lewis. We got to get rid of him and all of that. There's merit to that thought. There's merit to that argument, especially with a disappointing 3-5-1 start. There's two things we're going to talk about with Marvin Lewis here, because that is obviously a hot topic amongst Bengals fans. I'm going to start off with the primetime thing. And a lot of fans don't want to recognize that the primetime thing is a real thing. You know, they point to, well, of course you're going to be playing better teams on primetime. Sometimes you're going to be playing those good teams on the road. Fine. But you look at Marvin Lewis in these big games and off of buys, and those are two major things. For all the things that Colin Cowherd bashes on with the Bengals, he has publicly said many times that that's how he gauges coaches, both in college and pro football. How do you do off of buys with extended preparation, and how do you do in these big games? Well, again, this game against the Giants on Monday night was an encapsulation of both of those items. It was on prime time, it was on the road, and it was off of a bye. The Bengals had 2 weeks to prepare for this game, and they still lost. So you look at Marvin Lewis in prime time. I believe his record is at 6-24. That's awfully poor. You look at those games in the Andy Dalton era, they're 3-12, and these are including the playoffs as well. And then you look at Marvin Lewis off of buys, and you go, he's 5-8-1. Those aren't good stats for a guy that has rebuilt this team and has built a winner in a competitive team. But that's still the stumbling block for this team. Is it preparation? Is it overall roster talent? Is it shrinking in all of the limelight? Is it all of the above? I don't know. But at some point, for me, that has to come into question with Marvin Lewis and his leadership of this team. This team is not getting it done in the big games, the games where they need to win and take the next step, those playoff games. They're just not getting it done. And he's had 14 years to do it. I mean, I mentioned the Dalton primetime stats. It's not just Andy Dalton at the helm. It's also with Carson Palmer. Same thing. So there's one constant with these issues, and it's Marvin Lewis. So that being said, Scott, you have some points you want to make about the potential of firing Marvin Lewis. Is that a good idea? Isn't a good idea? What do you think?
Well, I think it's obviously something that's debatable, which is why it's a good topic to bring up, because there probably isn't a right answer. I think arguments can be made either way for keeping him or getting rid of him. I think one thing we've seen, because he's been there so long, there are definite traits and definite things you can see about his attributes, kind of what he brings, doesn't bring to the team, as far as why you'd want to keep him or get rid of him. So I have a couple points why I think the team might be better served going in a different direction that I think have worked against the team. The first one is he has this very strong tendency of hanging on to mediocre players too long, favoring a veteran presence over better younger players as far as playing time, making a roster. That's something he's said before. It's kind of everyone who follows the team kind of knows that's the direction they go. And there's, countless examples, even going all the way back to the whole debacle of picking Nate Livings over Evan Mathis, or drafting Carlos Dunlap, having him fall to them in the draft, and then sitting him for 3 years behind Robert Gathers. Yep. And over that span, I think Dunlap as a backup who was getting like a third the snaps out-sack Gathers, like 20-7 or 20-6 or some, totally absurd. Everyone watching the games is like, why isn't this guy starting? And it's, well, he doesn't practice right. He doesn't, silly stuff. And
we saw
how much better could
on Monday with Wallace Gilberry comes into the game, replaces Margus Hunt, who obviously hasn't been playing great as of recently, but Wallace Gilberry comes in, and the one play I notice him is, of course, the 25-yard run by Rashad Jennings when his dude just completely negates him from the play, and Jennings blows by him. And Hunt wouldn't have, for as poorly as Hunt, Hunt hasn't been bad, but he hasn't had any of those plays this entire year. And you bring in Gilbert, and what do you know? Like, as soon as he comes in, you see one of those plays.
And that's what we see. Like we've talked about it before in the podcast, Mike Nugent. He's been a below-average kicker ever since his first year here. they never bring in true competition for him. It's usually guys that weren't that good in college who really don't have a shot in the NFL. John Brown, Tom Oberski, people like that.
Yep.
They, he's our guy. He's our guy. It doesn't matter if he misses every field goal. We saw that the Vikings recently just cut Blair Walsh. He's been much better over the last 5 years than Nugent has. But like, hey, we didn't make a change, and we're doing it. And something like D'Amato Pecco, granted, they haven't had a whole lot to replace him with, but they continue to give him a ton of snaps. Or the linebackers, the Ray Maluga, Vincent Ray over Dawson and Vigil. Not that Dawson and Vigil are not necessarily better, but we're not even given a chance to see if they're better. Or things like Tyler Reifert, great player. They drafted him his rookie year. At the end of his season, they're like, yeah, I guess we underutilized him. Maybe we shouldn't have thrown the ball more. Well, yeah, that's why you drafted the guy.
Right.
Or, they do that with like Drake Kirkpatrick. He sat for 3 years. And, Denard, they draft these guys with no intention of sitting or, just to sit them. And so there's a lot of very questionable decisions like that I think have really hampered the team. And that gets me to the second point, which is the drafts. I know a lot has been said about how the Bengals have a great system. They do a good job drafting. They get these guys. They get good values. And if you look at the core of the playoff run, the teams that have made the playoffs those 5 straight years, the best players that were drafted by Cincinnati, they're on those teams, are probably going to be Andy Dalton, A.J. Green, Carlos Dunlap, Geno Atkins. As far as drafted players, all of them came in 2010, 2011. They got Dunlap and Atkins in 2010, Green and Dalton in 2011. Since then,
and Bowling too.
Yeah, and Bowling would be another one, the one they got in 11 in the 4th round. So you have those that great core, and yeah, you draft these great guys, and that's wonderful. But since then, 2012, you draft Drake Kirkpatrick, you sit him for 3 years. Zeitler's been decent, but they also drafted Still and Sanu kind of early. Still was out of the league
too.
Yeah, Sanu he was never really great. 2013, they did get Eifert correct. I'll give him credit for that. But your next 2 picks, Hunt has really struggled. And then Sean Williams has definitely had some issues, especially in coverage. I'll admit, I'm not a big fan of him when it comes to passing plays. The next year, Denard really can't see the field. Whenever he does, he tends to always be a step behind, or just not providing that shutdown corner that you would hope you'd get in the first round, and not just kind of a slot guy. After him, Will Clark hasn't done anything. Russell Bodine, I think we've beaten him to death on here. The next year, top 2 pick, Cedric Ogbuehi. I mean, he's struggled mightily at right tackle. Jake Fisher hasn't been any better. Dawson and Hardison can't see the field. So you just have this litany of players since that 10-11 draft who have just really, had issues, and they just haven't lived up to, I guess, average expectations. And so I think he's getting a lot of mileage off of 2 really good drafts. And even you go to the drafts before that, you have guys like, Keith Rivers in the first round and, Jerome Simpson. They just had a lot. They've just haven't had the drafts equal to what he seems to get credit for. And I know a lot of people will defend him because he does a great job drafting, but I think a lot of it just comes to 2 solid drafts that, it's been half a decade. We don't have that track record of, this is a great drafting team. And if they do draft the right guys, they don't play them. So I'd say for those reasons, I think it's time possibly for the team to look beyond Marvin, because, you know what you're going to get. We know what he can do. We know what he can't do. And I think the things he can't do have been things that have limited the team or kept them from doing better than they have done.
I love a couple of points you brought up there, Scott. One of which is PJ Dawson. And I get it. I mean, you want to send a message to a young player, and maybe he's late to meetings and he's sleeping in, or he's not practicing as hard as you would like, but very productive college player. You spent a 3rd-round pick on him. You see Carlos Dansby struggling. You see Vinny Ray have his ups and downs out there. Maybe he's not the fastest guy, but he at TCU, he created a lot of turnovers, and that's something that the linebacker group is not doing right now. And might he be an upgrade? I don't know. Might he be a total downgrade, and that's why he's currently on the practice squad? I don't know. But at some point, you got to let some of these guys sink or swim, to your point, Scott. And that kind of leads me to another point. And Connor, I want to get your thoughts too, because I think you have a little bit of a different mindset than Scott with the Marvin Lewis thing. But when you look at, for years, we've heard about the Bengals and their draft philosophy and how they keep acing the draft and all of these things. And that's great. I mean, it really is encouraging from a fan perspective as you go into a season. But you're starting to see these guys finally, some of these guys are either not playing or they're finally getting some playing time, and they're not playing very well. So you have Darquez Dennard struggling. Josh Shaw has had some ups and downs already this year. Sean Williams, you mentioned, Scott. I mean, there's guys that are getting time and they're not really playing that well. Well, there's another team that operates under a very similar type of mantra, I guess, and that's the Green Bay Packers. And now all of a sudden you see them, a team that only relies on the draft, is not aggressive in free agency, is not aggressive in terms of trading up into a draft or making player trades like the Bengals. And now you see them struggling when injuries hit, when these young guys are started to count on, and maybe they're not quite the players that you think they are when you drafted them. This starts to call into question the team philosophy of basically only relying on the draft. Again, Carlos Dansby, the Bengals had two major outside signings this year, and both were for minimum money, and Carlos Dansby and Brandon LaFell. Brandon LaFell does now co-lead the team in touchdown receptions, but again, last night, one catch for, I think, 9 yards. That's not getting it done. And obviously some of these sacks that we're talking about with the offensive line might have to do with the fact that these guys aren't always getting open, and Dalton has to hang on to the ball and go through his progression. So there's just a multitude of issues. I think the culture, I don't think the Bengals need to go and get the top tier free agents, but I think they need to be a little aggressive. And if there's a guy in the draft that they like, best player available does work quite often. However, if you need a spot and you need an athletic linebacker, you want to add another pass rusher, maybe you move up and sacrifice a pick and get that guy instead of getting maybe another athletic corner yet again in the first round, or something like the two offensive tackles in 2015. Maybe you have a different operation as a team, and we've heard that now this is the mantra that's been built with Marvin Lewis, Duke Tobin, and Katie Blackburn, not so much Mike Brown. So the Bengals are a conservative franchise in their history. The Packers have been as well, but you're starting to see both those teams struggle based on them solely relying on the draft and not really doing much at all in free agency trades, trading up in the draft, things like that. So that's something that I've kind of been thinking about as this team continues to struggle. But that being said, Connor, you might have a little bit of a different viewpoint from Scott in terms of if it's a good idea to get rid of Marvin Lewis and move on. Now, I don't think we're all talking about firing Marvin Lewis mid-season. I don't think that's –
yeah, that's not.
I don't think that's what we're talking about. Yeah, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking maybe see how this season plays out, because we don't want to be too knee-jerk reaction. We've seen this team make some late season pushes under Marvin Lewis after slow starts. But if the team ends up struggling and either has a losing record or a mediocre record, what are your thoughts on the status of Lewis?
I think you guys made a lot of very good points, and I don't agree with everything. I strongly disagree with some. I disagree with some. I agree with some. I strongly agree with some. So I'll start off with, I think the one that really caught my attention was the whole, LaFell's production's been down a few games. I kind of have this feeling that every time the Bengals start to lose, that fans really just kind of continue to repeat the same narratives. And I think a lot of that has to do, honestly, with the primetime, which, by the way, the primetime argument, I think, for so long I'd felt a certain way that, the primetime is just coincidence, they're playing good teams, whatever it might be. I think it has some merit. I think that, there's certain games that the team needs to be ready for. The bye week, you have so much time to prepare. The primetime game is just one of those games where you have a chance to really define your identity in front of the nation as a team. And I think part of the reason why the Bengals have had such a strange reputation, as we all know that people want to chop Lewis's head off as soon as the Bengals lose a game, that people want to throw Dalton under the bus as soon as he throws a pick. all these different perceptions. The Bengals are perennial chokers. That comes from the fact that they can't win games in primetime. That's the perception of the nation of this team, is because it stems from the fact that Marvin Lewis can't win in primetime. I think that has merit. The one thing I disagree with, I don't think you're completely wrong in it. I just think that with the whole argument with the receivers, LaFell not being, I can't really say I'm on board with the whole free agency approach. I think the Bengals have done a good job with it. I think there's certain scenarios where they definitely need to be better. For example, though LaFell, I think, was a great signing, and I think he's a quality number 2 receiver in today's NFL. I mean, he's really a middle tier number 2 wide receiver, I think, the grand scheme of the NFL, with plenty of high round young draft picks. Devin Funchess comes to mind. Michael Floyd, who has been really underachieving in Arizona. Think of all the bad teams who don't have good receivers, San Francisco, or all these different teams. He hasn't been productive in every single game, but I mean, he's the same kind of player as Marvin Jones. They're going to have big games every now and then, but Marvin Jones, even as a receiver, I think his impact has been greatly exaggerated once he left the team. You see in Detroit now, I mean, he was the league leader in receiving yards after a couple of weeks, and he's had several very outings where he just wasn't even on the field. He played, but he had, I think, 10 yards in a game either last week or the week before. And so with that, I think the free agency approach, don't necessarily agree with. That being said, Monday night was really the first time, I think, as someone who's followed this team, that I've been this frustrated with Marvin Lewis. It's just like you guys said, there's an issue with drafting and developing, and with Scott, I think the year 2011-2012 is a little harsh. I think 2011, 2012, and 2010 too. 2010 was the year with Geno Atkins, and I think Dunlap was 2010.
Yeah, they were both 2010.
It was basically, it was 2010, 2011, and 2012. And Scott, I don't think, gave enough credit to the class of 2012. Zeitler's been very good. Kirkpatrick has really come into his own. He's obviously still an inconsistent player, but we've seen the upside with him. His pick, everything inside of me wanted to be like, oh, that was just a bad pass by Eli. But that was a very good pick by Dre. That's really the best interception he's had of his career, and he's obviously had a lot of good picks, but that one was really
it's a very athletic play. He
read him and made the play, and that was very encouraging to watch in a year where he's been very good at times. We saw the Steelers game. So that being said, and you have Marvin Jones, Mohamed Sanu, George Iloka. They hit a ton on that class, and it obviously took time for them to develop. But that's been the issue with the Bengals, has been developing players, and I think that when you talk about that, I can't blame it all on Marvin Lewis. Especially have so many new coaches, an entire new staff on defense with Jim Haslett at linebackers coach, whoever their defensive line coach is, Kevin Coyle in the secondary. There's so many different coaches, and developing players it's not like Marvin Lewis is the only coach on the field. And having worked for a team, I can say that the head coach is only one of all these coaches. It's not like he's the guy who is on a pedestal with a microphone calling out all these things, and all the other coaches are standing there listening to him. The position coaches are really the guys who are interacting with the players the most out of all these coaches. And so, not that, nothing's on Marvin Lewis, it's all on the position coaches, but I think the Bengals need a chance. And this is all devil's advocate. I said earlier that, Marvin Lewis, firing him isn't just going to make the team better. And what I mean by that isn't that, the team can't get better if they fire him. I think that's a legitimate scenario the Bengals need to consider in the offseason if things continue to go down this road. What I mean by that is that they need a solution, and you need a coach who you think can help this team win very quickly. And there aren't that many guys in the NFL. Not that there aren't any, but you need some of those guys. But back to my point, is just that I can't blame the whole drafting and developing all on Lewis. There's plenty of coaches that interact with players. We don't know if Marvin's. He's obviously very involved with the front office, but none of us really know who's making the picks in the Bengals draft room, and it's a combination. I'm guessing of. I would still guess that Duke Tobin probably has more say in the personnel, but the biggest flaw with them has been it's just a matter of scheme and their concepts and the fact that their whole defense is predicated on not changing, and that's not wrong. It worked
But
last year. We
isn't
saw
that
last year
isn't
Paul
that
Gunther.
coaching? Isn't that coaching?
That's, I mean, that's part of it. Yeah, is but we saw last year Paul Gunther's scheme worked very well. The Bengals had a top three scoring defense in the NFL, and the personnel changes, and it's not like you can't blame it all on the players. Obviously, Gunther needs to adapt, but I can't fault him for trusting his guys and hoping they play. But at some point, I have to blame the front office for, and I've hit this point home a million times, is that the Bengals don't have the linebacker personnel they need to run the defensive scheme they're running. And on offense, they need to run the ball more. They didn't see them run the ball on Sunday or on Monday against the Giants, and every single game and it's not like the Giants got they score on their first drive, but they were never ahead by, I believe, more than a score. And so the Bengals had several opportunities to run, but they didn't run, and they didn't put Jeremy Hill in. I don't know if that was an injury. I think he looked like he got hit by Gio Bernard on the sidelines on one play, but even with Gio, you can still run the ball with Gio. I mean, they're not running it. They're playing a vanilla D, which has worked, but it's not working for them this year. And you have to do something at the end of the day. I mean, that's what, like you're saying, Anthony, that's what coaching is you have to adapt. That's why, for me, like the changing in coaching, we saw Andy Reid like leave Philadelphia after such a long time. He goes to Kansas City, and they still haven't. I think they won a playoff game against Houston last year, but I wouldn't call that success really. It's not a Super Bowl. But we saw Andy Reid. He got a fresh start in Kansas City, and things have been going better for him. His teams have been playing very well. The Chiefs are the number one seed, I believe, in the AFC right now. And Alex Smith is playing like a good quarterback, which, I mean, that's good coaching. I think, honestly, Marvin Lewis needs a fresh start more than anything. I mean, the Bengals are a good team, and I think that I don't think they should just like we were all saying. I don't think it's just something that it's still just something that I'm considering at this point. I don't know if I still am sold on the fact that the Bengals need to sell, or I mean, get rid of Marvin Lewis. But Marvin Lewis is a good head coach for what he is, and I think that a fresh start would help him just as much as a fresh start would help the Bengals. Andy Reid turned his career back around in Kansas City, and they have a contender there. Marvin Lewis turned around the Bengals. He transformed the franchise into what it is right now, to the point where fans are frustrated with a 3-5-1 start, which is still more wins than the team was getting before Lewis was even in with Cincinnati. So I like Marvin Lewis as a guy. I understand why a lot of people don't. I would love to see him turn around a team like the Niners or the some other team that needs a head coach to turn around ship for them. It'd be exciting to watch. Or the Jags, or Marvin Lewis of the Jags, I would love to see. I think that'd be a perfect match for him. But it's becoming harder and harder and harder to say that the Bengals shouldn't fire Lewis. And I'll say this one thing to cap it off. The devil's advocate scenario is you have Dalton, you have Green, like we're talking about, these draft classes, they're all still very young. We saw the Broncos got rid of, John Fox. They hired Gary Kubiak and win the Super Bowl in Kubiak's first year. We saw in 2002, the Bucks fired him. They hire John Gruden, and they win the Super Bowl in the first year. Tanking is not a proven formula. We've seen so many teams tank and not get anything out of it. The Chiefs got Eric Fisher with the first overall pick in 2013. Haven't done anything since. The Jags perennially have top 5 picks. And who was the last top 5 pick the Jags have had pan out for them? Justin Blackmon, who is no longer in the NFL at this point. I mean, Jadeveon Clowney has played very well this year for the Texans, but he's not been he's not been the reason why they turned around. And they're not turning around. Brock Osweiler is playing terribly. Having a top 5 pick only generally seems to work when you're picking a franchise quarterback, like an Andrew Luck, who's turned around the Colts. But losing doesn't help a team win in the long term. My opinion. I also think that firing a coach, if you fire Lewis, you're going to have to consider that the Bengals are probably changing schemes. That doesn't mean they're going to go 4-3 to 3-4, but that means Dalton is going to have to learn something new. AJ Green is going to have to learn something new. All these guys who've been in this system for so long, all the guys on offense and defense, probably, because if you fire Lewis, you're probably going to fire his staff, or the staff is going to want to leave. You're going to have to change things, and that's going to take time. And how much time do the Bengals really have? People want to talk about a closing window. The window only closes when you close the window, and so trying to turn things around is only going to work if they have a coach who can immediately help this team turn around. And at the end of the day, regardless of how you feel about Marvin Lewis, that's a gamble.
Just to kind of close this segment off on Lewis and his status with the Bengals, you referenced Andy Reid, and I believe his stat as a coach off of buys is something absurd, like 16-2 or 18-2, something awesome. And
yeah, he's the king of the bye week.
Yeah, he's amazing off of buys, and that spells that points to a coach that prepares well off of an bye week and gets his team ready off of a bye week, and that to me points to pretty solid coaching. I will say this. This season could go basically one of three ways. Either the Bengals totally just pack it in and don't end up playing very well. They end up making a great run and potentially make the postseason. Or what I think is the worst thing that could happen to them is they still hit this lull, they lose some games, and then they get a late season surge, miss the playoffs, but still have a mediocre record, because then Mike Brown and his staff then have a reason to say, well, hey, this team really is still playing hard for Marvin Lewis. This team is still fighting, and we have these built-in excuses of personnel losses and all of that, and they still made a good effort of it. I think we all want to see them turn it around and make the playoffs, and I think that the talent's there. A lot of things need to change, but I really don't want to see a mediocre season, because then nothing will change. They think that they're still right there, and that things don't need to change. I mean, if they're successful, they don't need to change. But if they're not successful or they're mediocre, then things need to change, because that's been the story of Marvin Lewis in his tenure with the Bengals for the most part. Those are our thoughts on Marvin Lewis and his status with the Bengals beyond 2016. What are your thoughts? You can get in touch with us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. You can email us at theobinsider@gmail.com. You can check us out on YouTube. We are live and fielding fan questions, by the way. We've already got a couple, so if you have a couple more here, we're gonna get to those in just a second. But if you have a couple last-minute ones, definitely hit us up on our YouTube channel. You can check out our content on SoundCloud as well as YouTube. And we post this show on Cincy Jungle every week, as well as some of the segments we do. So check that out. And, of course, we are also on iTunes, so check us out there.